All right, so I guess I'll get started. My name is Jake Shore, and today we're going to be doing a little bit of a two-part biography of Herod the Great. Um, Part of what I want to do this is just understand some of the context of what happens in between the Old Testament and New Testament, and Herod the Great represents a lot of how much had changed during that sort of 400-year period in between the Testaments. And so next week, I'll be talking primarily about Herod himself, but today is going to be a discussion of the intertestamental period, that period in between the Old and New Testaments, between Malachi and Matthew. So if this were a book biography, you might consider today sort of a very long preface to the rest of the book. So, the intertestamental period, this period lasted from around 420 to the birth of Jesus. The only comparable gap that we have in a very continuous biblical narrative, only similar gap happens after the book of Genesis and the events, the story of Joseph and his father Jacob moving his family to Egypt. And of course, when you pick up in Exodus, some between 300 and 500 years later, depending on the dating, a very great deal has changed. So, if we set our clocks, go into the Wayback Machine, going back all the way to the 11th century BC, what we find is we have the kingdom of Israel established under Saul, and then growing in power and influence under David, and reaching really its peak in power and wealth under King Solomon. But under his son Rehoboam, the kingdom splits into two, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, where the capital is in Jerusalem. Now, after several hundred years of various kings, in the north and the south, northern Israel is conquered. The northern kingdom of Israel is conquered by the Assyrians. Now, the Assyrians were a very fearsome bunch, and they began a practice of taking their enemies into captivity. The Assyrians were very ruled by military might. They ruled by fear. They were the first Iron Army. They were the first empire of the Iron Age. That is, they used iron weapons, which are much, as opposed to bronze weapons. Iron weapons were much cheaper and much more effective. So, they conquered most of the Middle and ancient Near East. They conquered Israel, taking most of the population there, transported them back to Assyria, and they're scattered about, and they pretty much disappear from the historical record. The southern kingdom will last for another couple hundred years until the Assyrian Empire is defeated by the Babylonian Empire, or the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which is mentioned in the Book of Kings and Chronicles under King, and of course eventually the Book of Daniel as well, King Nebuchadnezzar. Eventually, Nebuchadnezzar sets up Zedekiah as king of the southern kingdom of Judea. Zedekiah foolishly decides to take sides and rebel against Nebuchadnezzar, taking sides with Egypt, assuming that Egypt will come to their defense, which they don't. And then you have the story, I think it's in Kings, where 2 Kings, where Zedekiah is, after Jerusalem is besieged and eventually razed to the ground in 587, the temple destroyed, Zedekiah is tracked down and has his sons killed in front of him before his eyes are taken out, and then he, along with tens of thousands of Jews, are taken back to Babylon, and that becomes what we call the Babylonian captivity. Now, the Babylonian captivity we call the diaspora, which is just this Jewish community that exists outside of their traditional homeland. They're there. See, that happens in 587 BC. The difference between that and the captivity that happened under the Assyrians is they're not scattered. They're allowed to they're given a certain amount of freedom. They're just relocated. They're allowed to continue their religious practices, to have homes, and to basically live out their lives. And so that lasts some 60, 70 years, and eventually and of course that, by the way, that prophets such as Ezekiel and then Daniel were among those taken in captivity. And of course, we hear the stories in the book of Daniel and Ezekiel. So, the Babylonian Empire is then succeeded by the Persian Empire. And the Persian Empire is very different. Can anyone here tell me why? How does the Persian Empire sort of depicted? How are the Persians depicted, or Persian dynasty or the Persian rule depicted in the Bible? Yeah.
Persians were more religiously tolerant.
They were more tolerant. Yep, they're religiously tolerant. And when they conquered people, they had their attitude was, you may govern yourselves, essentially, as long as you pay tribute, supply troops to the army, you can pretty much live out your lives as you wish. Okay? Essentially, govern yourselves as long as you maintain loyalty, pay tribute, and are called upon when the army has to go to war. So, beyond that, the Persians were even more generous to that, and we see in the book of Nehemiah, we hear that not only Cyrus he returns all of the captives from Babylon, he allows all the Jews to return to their city. He even supplies money first of all, he opens up the treasury and allows the Jews to take all the stuff that was taken from them by the Babylonians, some of the items that were in the temple, and then supplies money and sends officials there, including Nehemiah, to go back to the job of rebuilding the temple. So, the Persians, in contrast, are very generous, which is something that's very different from what we find in the West. As Westerners, we tend to identify ourselves more with the Greeks in movies and culture and such, because the Greeks have influenced so much of our, of course, government, science, philosophy, things like this. Ideas sort of democracy and independence, freedom, and things like this. Some of you who may have seen a not-so-great movie called 300, which depicts the story of the Persians, or the Greeks defending the 300 Spartans, defending the pass at Thermopylae, delaying the Persian invasion long enough for the Athenian fleet or the Greek fleet to eventually defeat the Persians. And so the Greeks are depicted as sort of these, in the film, and a lot of other literature, is sort of the Greeks are depicted as brave defenders of democracy and freedom, and the Persians are this opulent, strange, Oriental, Eastern empire looking to subdue and crush everything in its path. In reality, it would have been far better to live under Persian rule than even Greek, and especially Spartan rule. The Greeks, and the Spartans in particular, were as pagan can get, with a number of very perverse practices and things like this. But in reality, the Persians were much more, I would say, enlightened and tolerant empire, and gained a great deal of loyalty because of the independence and tolerance that they exercised to their client kingdoms. So, The Persians, they allowed the temple to be rebuilt, and then we find in the book of Nehemiah the story, he is sent there, he's the cupbearer to the king Artaxerxes. He's sent back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple, specifically to actually rebuild the wall. And then he is succeeded by Ezra. And Ezra is important because Ezra is the guy who is responsible for sort of rebuilding Jewish religious life and adherence and culture, because those that were left there, only a few, maybe 10, I can't remember the exact number, a few thousand, perhaps 10,000 that were returned, that actually chose to return. Not everyone, not all the Jews that were left, that were transported or moved to Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar, decided to return. The rest many chose to stay there. And those that did return, there was a lot of conflict between the Jewish population, scattered as though it was, around the countryside of Jerusalem, and ruled by Samaria. And of course, there was a lot of bad blood between the Jews and Samaritans, because the Samaritans were descendants of the Assyrians. When they populated the area after they took the Jews, back to Nineveh or to Assyria, they populated, settled people there who eventually adopted the Jewish religion, but were never accepted fully as Jewish people. So that was sort of the context in which returning Jews were facing. More than that, few of them even spoke Hebrew anymore. Most of them spoke Aramaic, which was sort of like the lingua franca of the ancient world at this time, and that continues all the way up until the New Testament. Jesus probably spoke Aramaic. Aramaic, referring to the Arameans, who were a trading people that live in Syria. And it became the language of commerce, and so was spoken throughout the Persian Empire. So, part of Ezra's task was to reestablish adherence, shall we say, to religious Jewish practices. And so he was sent as an official by the Persians to sort of reignite Jewish adherence to traditional Jewish religion and law. Why do you suppose the Persian Empire would be part of that? Actually actively take a part in trying to reestablish, because typically independent religions are sort of viewed by conquering empires as being something to be suspicious of or to be feared, because it may involve loyalty to a religion, a god, over religious or over loyalty to the state. Why do you suppose that would be the case, that the Persians were okay with sending someone there to reestablish Jewish religious life, essentially? Yeah.
So they have an example to watch with the Babylonians and the Assyrians as to how it went for them during their times, and there were historians who kept some of that, I'm sure, that. And then maybe the concept was we'll try a different method, a different route.
Yeah. Again, allowing sort of having that toleration and people believing that they have some sort of say over their own cultural life. Absolutely. I think another part of it is that how does religion help a society? What benefits does it offer a society or a culture? Yeah, it stabilizes it. I think that was a big part of it, is that religious adherence typically involves adherence to religious cultural practices, usually means that people are sort of unifies people, creates stability because they're adhering to certain moral codes and things like this. So, Persian Empire, very, very different, is often depicted. Yes?
Don't we have a vision to King Cyrus by God and all this too?
I'm sorry, say that one more
Don't
time.
we have a vision provided by God or a dream to King Cyrus and all this
You say we, what do you mean by we?
too? The Bible?
Oh, the Bible?
Yeah. It wasn't he given a dream and told to send these people back?
Talk about the statue.
No, a direct dream.
Was it Cyrus or was it I can't remember.
I believe,
If Cyrus was given a dream to return the people.
I may be mistaken, but I believe it was Cyrus.
That may be the case. That may be the case. I'm sorry. I wish I yes.
Well, I appreciate the history.
Yeah.
I think you do very well at summarizing a lot of years there. In Ezra chapter 1, verse 1, it says that the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his realm and to put it in writing. And it goes on to say that we're going to go ahead and essentially help reestablish Jerusalem.
Yes.
And as well. So I know that people do different things in history at different times for various reasons. But from our point of view as people who believe the Bible, God has a hand in this, and He moves certain people to do certain things at certain times. And so that, we can't ignore that. This is the Bible.
No, sure. I don't mean in the course of explaining this to do it from some totally secular point of view. I'm trying to do it in really broad strokes. But yes, of course, God has a hand in trying to, and it talks about this specifically through the prophets as Israel is reestablished. And of course, they are blessed because when they do reestablish their religious practices, eventually they gain a measure of independence to their dogged adherence to it, which we'll get to in just a couple of minutes. And we get to, again, the end of the Old Testament, of Malachi, and are sort of left of this picture of this it describes in Ezra is reading for the first time out loud, because again, Hebrew was not really spoken. And so he is brought there, actually, I think it's under Nehemiah, is for the first time, it is translated by the scribes that are brought there. The Old Testament, the Torah is translated to Aramaic, and so these people, for the first time, even though they up to that point they had been hearing through Jewish traditions, but all sort of been passed down through tradition, oral tradition, things like this, but now for the first time in a very long time, and it describes Nehemiah how they wept as they heard the word of God and the law spoken for the first time in some of them perhaps their whole lives. So it was very significant. So when Ezra gets there to sort of reestablish, sent there by God to reestablish faithfulness to the law, and it's really, the one thing I'll say about this is it does mark a real difference in Jewish life in that, and this has some consequences that we will find in the Gospels, is that Jewish identity up to that point had largely, the law had always been connected with it, but it was also their identity as God's people, as descendants of Abraham. One of the consequences after Ezra is that they become increasingly identifying themselves with the law. And that has some, not necessarily bad consequences, but it definitely has an effect on Jewish religious life and the sort of world that Jesus steps into when he begins his ministry. So, and then sort of the historical record, at least for the biblical narrative there, after Malachi, drops off, and then we have this roughly 400 year period where we don't know what happens. Well, we know what happens, but but it's not spoken of much in the Bible. And we just know that we leave off, we have the Jewish people trying to reestablish the temple in Jerusalem under Persian rule, and then when we come back, we have this pseudo-Jewish kind of king ruling as a governor or a client king of the Roman Empire. So it's in essence, I'm just saying that a lot has changed. And so I'll cover briefly what that looks like. And so probably the most significant thing that happens during that period is in the 330s, Alexander the Great essentially changes the world. So Alexander was a Greek, he was actually Macedonian, which is this territory, it's this backwater northern territory above mainland Greece. The Greeks were considered the Macedonians to be barely Greek. They were kind of a warring tribal society until they're unified under this guy named Philip. Philip unifies and rules all of Macedon, and then he conquers through military conquest or diplomacy, conquers the entirety of the Greek world. And he created this almost invincible army by combining as a young man, he was held as a political hostage in Thebes. Thebes had conquered Sparta. And so he learned from the greatest military minds of the time and the best infantry in the world, which was the Greeks, combined with Macedonian cavalry practices. That's not that important, but what is important is that he took in 490 and 480, twice on two different occasions under Darius and Xerxes, the Persian Empire tried to invade Greece, to expand their empire, and the Greeks were able to fight them off before they got to mainland Greece. But Greek colonies, Greek cities in Asia Minor, basically you have here's Greece, Mediterranean, and then across on is what is now Turkey on the other side of the Aegean Sea. That was very much considered to be as much Greece as mainland Greece, because those Greek colonies had been established there. The Greek way of life was established there, and those cities had been sacked and taken over by the Persians. And Philip wanted to take revenge on the Persians and marches his armies eastward and conquer the Persians as revenge for what they had done in those previous incursions. But unfortunately, he was assassinated before he could do that. And then his son Alexander, who took over in his stead, sort of kept that dream alive. And after solidifying his control over Greece, moved eastward, and in a couple of battles, two significant battles over the next several years, conquered the entirety of the Persian Empire, and pushed all the way even into India, and had gone farther and farther than any empire had ever gone before. You probably may recall he went down to Egypt. There's a famous story about he goes to the city of Tyre, which is a Phoenician city, and it's built on a little island. And he had to conquer that so that the Persian Navy did not come behind him after they marched through it and then undo everything they had done. So he had to defeat and conquer all of these port cities. And Tyre was a Persian port city, and so they resisted, and he spent 7 months building a bridge out to the city before eventually conquering it. and razing it to the ground and killing everyone that lived there. So Alexander was not only brilliant, but he was pretty ruthless as well. For the purposes of the world that Jesus eventually steps into, what's important is that by Alexander conquering this huge period, this vast empire, he didn't get to rule long. He caught a fever and died on his way back home. Never saw Greece again. But and then the next 30 years, his control of the empire was fought over in sort of a series of wars between all of his generals to who would succeed him. Eventually, it settled primarily on 3, and for our purposes, 2 of his generals. Ptolemy, who took over Egypt, and Seleucus in Asia Minor, the Near East, Palestine, and Seleucus became the Seleucid Empire, and then the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. And what really changed the world was not sort of this simply a military conquest. It was Greek culture. We call it the Hellenized world. The Greeks call themselves the Hellas or the Hellenes, and so Hellenization is essentially what took place over the next couple hundred years, which is to simply say that everyone loved Greek culture. Okay, Greek art, Greek science, Greek philosophy, not as much Greek government, because the Macedonians didn't practice democracy. But it became sort of to draw a modern parallel, what's cool, what's stylish, what's fashionable, what's in vogue, and that was Greek culture, from dress to art. And the Jews were no exception to this. And over time, they began adopting many of these, just as they had done before, many cultures before that we've seen throughout the Old Testament. They began adopting many of these practices. They spoke Greek, they dressed Greek. They even went to such extremes as going to a very, shall we say, a dicey surgery to undo circumcision, so that they would look like Greeks when they participated in athletic events, which were typically done under Greek culture, where they competed in the nude. So these outdoor gymnasiums were built, outdoor amphitheaters, all these things that became staples of Greek culture. And all of these things, again, were later adopted by the Roman Empire. That's part of why we recognize them so much, is because the Romans essentially copied it, so much of what they did. So that was sort of the world that it was essentially that the Palestine, Judea, the Jewish area of Palestine was becoming heavily Hellenized. And for the first, say, 100 years or so, control of Israel, the area of Israel, was sort of struggled back and forth from the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. Eventually, the Seleucids gained control. Were tolerant at first, and then under a guy named Antiochus, but his son or his descendant, another Antiochus IV, became extremely angry, became extremely hostile, and he essentially outlawed practice of the Jewish faith. And he did some horrific things. He outlawed worship of the temple. He destroyed whatever copies of the Torah existed, outlawed reading of the Torah. Any sort of worship, even circumcision, was met with death. He imposed pagan religious practices in the temple, sacrificed pigs on the altar in the temple, profaning it in the worst possible ways. And this, as you might imagine, angered the Jews, eventually to a tipping point to where they began to resist. And under a guy named Mattathias, somewhere around the year 167, decided he had 5 sons and he had had enough, and he led a revolt. He and his 5 sons, and eventually his son, he died, but his son Judas Maccabeus meaning hammer of God, and he and his brothers and his followers became known as the Maccabeans. The Maccabeans defeated the Greek rulers there, took back the temple in 164 BC, and drove them out. Eventually, there was some back and forth for about the next 20 years, and eventually, under the descendants of the Maccabeans, I should say Judas is killed, but his younger brother Simon is there eventually to defeat, finally, for the last time, the Seleucids, the Greeks, and they have the first independent Jewish kingdom in over 400 years, basically going back since the conquest of the Babylonians. So it's very, very significant. And then you have, from that point on, for the next 100 years, it is all of the descendants of Simon Maccabeus, or these Maccabeans, that essentially rule over. But again, in very little time, as zealous as they were, unfortunately and ironically, the descendants become increasingly Hellenized, that is to say, influenced by Greek culture, and began to rule less as sort of high priests as essentially kings, until the Romans come. And eventually the Romans do come. There is a sort of civil war of succession that erupts in Judea, and they both in treaty, they go to Rome to ask for Rome to settle it. Rome does, and then the Jews again eventually are become a client state. And the father of Herod the Great, a guy named Antipater, who was the advisor to the Maccabean dynasty, the last of the Maccabean dynasty, eventually becomes the ruler of Judea under the Romans. And so that's sort of where we leave off as we step into next week, which I will talk about Herod himself. But the important thing as we go into next week, and some of the lessons we can draw from this are the idea of power and how the Jews handled their relationship with power, okay, with temporal power rather than spiritual power, or versus contrasting with spiritual. That is, say, their adherence to God, submitting to His rule, as opposed to the earthly kings and such. And then also the struggle of the Jewish people at this time to maintain their Jewishness. That is to say, their adherence to law, the law of the Torah, and resisting increased Hellenization, becoming more worldly, essentially more Greek. And those are the two struggles that the Jews are facing as we get into the world that Jesus is born into. Any questions about that? It was kind of a giant download of information. Yes?
It seems, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it seems about this time that the Pharisees come into power too.
Yes.
Also the synagogues become a thing.
Yes, so a few different sort of religious sects, the Sadducees and the the Pharisees rise to prominence, both claiming to be sort of champions of the poor and champions of the Torah and traditional Jewish ways and things like this. Any other questions? All right. Well, part 2 next week, and we'll get into discussing Herod the Great, and trying to understand this obsession and relationship with power, temporal power, which is sort of exemplified by Herod, but we can all draw lessons from. All right. Well, thank you.